May 13, 1943, port of Bizerta, Tunisia. The Afrika Korps, the most feared desert fighting force on earth, was finished. For 3 years, Erwin Rommel's men had carved through North Africa like a blade through sand, outmaneuvering the British at Tobruk, nearly swallowing Egypt whole, making generals twice their age look like amateurs. They had been called the Desert Fox's wolves, invincible, unbreakable, the pride of 1,000 Wehrmacht briefings. But now, on this salt-bitten Mediterranean morning, 275,000 Axis soldiers were laying down their rifles on burning concrete, hands raised, eyes hollow, marching into captivity. One of them was Hauptfeldwebel Werner Brandt, Master Sergeant, 33 years old, survivor of 2 years in the African desert, a man who had seen a great deal of war and believed he understood the rules of it completely. He understood that prisoners suffered. He understood what came next. He was wrong about everything. If this story moves something in you, if history told this honestly still matters, hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. These voices from the past deserve to be heard, and your support makes sure they are. Share this with someone who still believes they know everything about this war. Werner Brandt had not panicked when the surrender came. Panic was for men who hadn't accepted what the desert had been telling them for months. By May of 1943, the math was inescapable. Rommel himself had fled. Resupply lines across the Mediterranean had been cut to ribbons by Allied air power. The panzer divisions that had once rolled like iron thunder across Libyan sand were running on fumes, patched together with prayers and spare parts that no longer existed. When the order came to lay down arms, Brandt set his rifle against a stone wall with the careful deliberateness of a man placing something he will never pick up again, and he waited. What he waited for, what every man around him silently braced for, was the machinery of enemy captivity. They all knew what it looked like. The Wehrmacht had shown them training films. Officers had briefed them in careful, specific language. American prison camps were brutal places, overcrowded, undersupplied, governed by guards who viewed the Geneva Convention as a suggestion rather than a law. Transportation to the camps, they were told, would be by freight car, locked, dark, no water, no food, no stops, the journey designed to break a man before he even arrived at whatever hell the Americans had built for him. The briefings had been detailed, confident, authoritative. They had the ring of truth precisely because they were so specific. Brandt had believed them the way you believe something you've been told enough times that questioning it stops feeling like an option. He was loaded onto a transport ship at Bizerte Harbor with approximately 8,000 other prisoners, packed below decks in the stifling heat of a North African May. The crossing to America took 3 weeks, 15 days at sea, then processing camps in Virginia, a place called Camp Patrick Henry near Hampton Roads, where Brandt and his fellow prisoners were documented, photographed, issued Red Cross kits containing a toothbrush, a small bar of soap, a thin towel. Not nothing, but not what he expected either. Small cracks began appearing in the briefing's certainty. The guards were professional, not cruel. The food was adequate. No one was beaten. These were inconveniences in the architecture of what Brandt believed. Not enough to bring the structure down, not yet. The structure came down on platform in Newport News, Virginia, on a gray Tuesday morning in July of 1943. Brandt was standing in formation with 60 other prisoners, winter light filtering through overcast sky, the smell of diesel and salt water still faint on the air, when the train came into the station. He heard it before he saw it, the long, low announcement of a locomotive decelerating, steam hissing in long exhales, the metallic percussion of heavy wheels grinding to a stop. Then he turned and looked at what was waiting for them, and his mind went completely, utterly still. The cars were silver and green. They gleamed like something from a peacetime world, lacquered, polished, catching what light there was and throwing it back doubled. They were passenger cars, not freight cars with wooden slats and barred ventilation slots, not livestock transports pressed into emergency military service. These were full civilian luxury passenger cars, Pullman sleeping cars operated by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The same rolling palaces that American businessmen and politicians used to travel between New York and Chicago. Along their flanks, in raised gold lettering, ran a name that Brant had seen in European rail magazines before the war: Pennsylvania Railroad. The name of an institution, the name of comfort. For a long moment, 60 German prisoners stood on a Virginia platform and said nothing. The silence was not the silence of men at peace. It was the silence of men whose entire understanding of their situation had just been handed back to them upside down, and who had not yet figured out how to hold it. Across the platform, one of the younger soldiers, barely 20, barely old enough to have a war, turned to Brant and whispered a single word in German: unmöglich, impossible. Brant didn't answer because he had no answer. He had exactly the same word running through his own mind, on a loop, unable to stop. The guards organized them efficiently, professionally. No shoves, no rifle butts against shoulders, 10 men per car, directed with the practiced calm of American military procedure at its most functional. Brant walked toward the nearest car because his legs moved before his mind gave permission, and when he reached the metal steps and gripped the handrail and climbed 1 step, 2 steps, 3, and stepped through the doorway, the world he had prepared himself for simply ceased to exist. The corridor was carpeted, dark green, clean, the fibers dense beneath his boots in a way that swallowed sound completely. The walls were paneled in dark wood, polished to warm shine. Electric light fixtures cast amber light from above, the kind of warm light that belongs in drawing rooms, in libraries, in places where men sit after dinner and argue about ideas. The air smelled of wood polish and something faintly sweet, the institutional cleanliness of something that is regularly, meticulously maintained. Brant stood in that corridor for perhaps 3 seconds before a guard gestured him forward, and even in those 3 seconds, the weight of evidence was already collapsing the briefings into rubble. His compartment was small, 6 feet by 6 feet, maybe slightly more, but it contained 2 upholstered bench seats in deep green fabric, a small folding table between them, reading lamps with brass fixtures mounted above each seat, and a window. Not an opening, not a slot. A window with clean glass and a curtain on small brass rod that could be drawn open or pulled shut. A window through which an enemy soldier being transported across an enemy continent could look out and watch that continent pass by like a traveler, like a human being with eyes and a right to see where he was going. Brant sat down on one of the bench seats. The cushion compressed beneath him, and the simple physical sensation of upholstery, of something soft, something designed for human comfort, receiving his weight produced in him an emotion he could not have named and did not try to. He simply sat. 3 other men filed in behind him, and they sat as well, and for several minutes the 4 of them said nothing, only looked at the compartment with the careful, cataloging attention of men trying to confirm that what they were seeing was actually real. Outside, through the glass, Newport News began to slide away. The platform disappeared. Warehouses replaced it, then roads, then the scrubby vegetation of the Virginia coast, then open countryside, brown fields stretching under flat gray sky, farmhouses trailing wood smoke, dirt roads connecting everything in the quiet geography of a country that the war had not touched, not scratched, not slowed, not rationed into gauntness. A country operating at full function, full abundance, while across the ocean, the nations that had started this war were eating their own infrastructure to survive. For every mile of German rail network bombed to fragments in 1943, American railroads were laying new track. For every German family subsisting on ersatz bread made from potato starch and sawdust, American farms were producing surpluses large enough to feed occupied Europe on top of their own population. The United States in 1943 consumed more steel in a single month than Germany produced in 6. These facts did not arrive in Brant's mind as statistics. They arrived as scenery, as intact farmhouses, unbroken roads, tractors working fields without army requisition papers. A country at war that looked so thoroughly like peace that peace and war had exchanged definitions without anyone informing the men who were supposed to be suffering on the losing side. An hour into the journey, a knock came at the compartment door. An American soldier, young, red-haired, rifle slung casually, leaned into the doorway with the relaxed posture of someone who found this assignment entirely unremarkable. He informed them, in fractured German, assembled apparently from a phrase book and determination, that lunch would be served in the dining car. 3 cars forward, they would be called. The dining car. Brandt had heard the words. He had processed them grammatically. He had not, initially, been able to make them mean anything. But when the call came 45 minutes later, and he walked through 2 Pullman cars and a pair of cold metal vestibules and pushed through the door into the dining car, meaning arrived all at once, and it was almost physically painful. White tablecloths covered every table. Real white linen tablecloths, laundered and pressed, the kind of thing Brandt associated with the hotel dining rooms his parents had taken him to in Hamburg for special occasions before the war. Silverware was set at each place with the geometric precision of professional table service. Small vases held paper flowers. Electric light swayed with the train's movement overhead, casting warm light across the whole improbable scene. American soldiers sat at their own tables, eating lunch, talking, laughing, reading newspapers, not performing hospitality, not performing anything, simply eating. Because it was lunchtime, because the dining car was open, because this was how functioning civilized country moved its people, all of its people, apparently, including its enemies, across its territory. A waiter in a white jacket with brass buttons appeared beside Brandt's table with the professional ease of someone for whom this represented simply another shift, another set of passengers. He placed a printed menu card on the table. Roast beef, baked chicken, beef stew, coffee, tea, or milk included. Brandt ordered the roast beef because the words were close enough to German that he understood them, and because his mind was still 2 steps behind his mouth, operating on instinct, while the rest of his consciousness attempted to process the evidence of the tablecloth beneath his hands and the menu in front of his face. When the food arrived, a plate with sliced roast beef and gravy, mashed potatoes with butter melting into a gold pool, green beans glistening and properly seasoned. A white roll that steamed when he opened it. He stared at it for a long moment before lifting his fork. The meat was good, not merely edible, not adequate. Good, properly butchered, properly cooked, rich with flavor and salt, and the uncomplicated satisfaction of food prepared by someone who understood what food was supposed to do for a human body. Brandt ate slowly, deliberately, the way men eat when they are afraid to finish, because finishing means returning to the world outside the plate. Around him, other prisoners ate in silence, or near silence, each one sealed inside their own private reckoning. A soldier across the table, older, with the flat 1,000-yard expression of an Eastern Front veteran, was crying without sound, tears falling into his stew, jaw still moving. He was not crying from grief, exactly. He was crying because everything he had been told had been wrong, and the wrongness had arrived in the form of a tablecloth and a hot meal, and those are precisely the kinds of things that break a man when nothing else could. Outside the dining car windows, America continued to exist at a scale that defied the imagination of men raised in a country the size of one American state. They had been traveling for hours through Virginia into the Carolinas, and the land simply did not end. It went on and on and on, farms, towns, rivers, small cities unmarked by any bomb, any evacuation, any visible sign of war other than the occasional factory working 3 shifts. By 1943, the United States was producing 47 million tons of merchant shipping per year. Germany, working at maximum industrial capacity, was sinking roughly 8 million tons. The arithmetic was not a military question. It was a geological one. You cannot defeat a continent. The sleeping arrangements arrived as the final astonishment in a day already full of them. As evening settled over whichever state they were crossing, Tennessee or Kentucky, the names blurred in darkness. Pullman attendants moved down the aisle with practiced calm. Seats folded into beds, berths lowered from the walls, stacked too high, each prepared with clean sheets, a pillow, and a wool blanket. Brandt lay in the lower berth, curtain drawn, the rhythm of the train steady beneath him, staring at a ceiling only inches from his face. He had expected cattle cars. He had been promised cattle cars' standing room, foul air, no light, no comfort. The Geneva Convention required only adequate transport. Freight cars would have satisfied the law. The Americans could have done the minimum and remained within their rights. Instead, they chose something else, not indulgence, not weakness. A decision rooted in principle, applied even to men who had fought against them. On the third morning, the train arrived at Camp Concordia, Kansas. Barbed wire stretched between wooden posts. Guard towers stood at each corner, barracks lined up in rigid geometry across flat land. It was a prison camp, guarded and enclosed, built to confine. Yet inside were wooden floors, glass windows, a mess hall serving 3 meals a day, an infirmary with an army doctor, a recreation hall with books, and a volleyball court. Within the certainty of captivity existed something Brant struggled to name. Dignity, not comfort, dignity. The steady recognition that prisoners were human beings who required food, sleep, medical care, and a fragment of privacy, not as rewards, but as rights. The Pullman birth had not been accidental. It was the natural extension of a system that read its own rules and chose to follow them. The propaganda in Germany had insisted American captivity meant brutality. The lies had been precise, because the truth would have been dangerous. A system that needed falsehoods about its enemy could not withstand honesty. On his second day, Brant worked on a Kansas wheat farm beside an elderly farmer who spoke through gestures and patience. At noon came sandwiches and coffee. At dusk, a firm handshake acknowledging a day's labor. That night, staring at the barracks ceiling, Brant felt something cold and clarifying. The truth had arrived quietly and rewritten everything. He never forgot it. 40 years later, Werner Brant was 73 years old, retired, living in Freiburg in a rebuilt Germany that looked nothing like the nation he had served. He still had, folded carefully in the back of a wooden box where he kept his most important documents, a small rectangular paper slip. It was a menu card from the dining car of a Pennsylvania Railroad Pullman train, dated July 1943. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, dinner roll, coffee included. He had kept it not as a souvenir of comfort, but as evidence of a lesson that had cost a world war to deliver. When his grandchildren asked him what the war had been like, Brant did not tell them about the desert or the surrender or the camps. He told them about the train, about standing on a platform in Virginia and seeing something that contradicted everything he had been prepared to believe, about eating a meal in a dining car with white tablecloths while the country that had every reason to hate him simply chose, without pressure, without audience, without obligation, to treat him as a human being instead. That is how you win, he would tell them. Not by being stronger, not by being richer, though America was both. You win by being better by actually following the rules you claim to believe in, even when following them costs something, even when the men on the other side would not have done the same. That's the kind of strength that doesn't fade when the ammunition runs out. He would set the menu card on the table between them, faded and soft with age, and let them read it. Roast beef, dignity. The two things for Werner Brant had become permanently inseparable. The train had carried him across America, but what it had really transported, what it had moved from one side of a man's life to the other, slowly, through 3 days of motion and revelation, was the understanding that cruelty is always a choice, and so is mercy. And in the end, which one a nation chooses in its quietest, least witnessed moments is the only honest measure of what that nation actually is. They chose better, and in doing so, they changed everything.